So glad to be here at Hope City today. Thank you so much for your time. You know, I know I said this the last time I was here, and so I apologize that I'm repeating myself, so apologize for that. But I just feel like this every time I come here. I want to apologize on behalf of all the people who are from the north that come here and destroy your perfect place. Like, you know, last night I was texting with Peter. I got on the plane, and I'm like, why are there all these old people on this plane? What is happening here? I was like, oh, right, yes, we're going to Sarasota. And I just felt bad for you. I'm like, wow, you have to deal with these people all the time. I'm like frustrated on one flight, let alone, all the time. So anyways, happy to be here today. I also, want to just take a moment to honor Pastor Peter and Tiffany. They're an incredible couple. They're just amazing people. You're very fortunate to have them as your leaders. They're amazing people. God's doing some incredible things in their lives and through their family and through this ministry. And so I'm just honored to play a very small part in the background, kind of watching from the sidelines. And they're great people. And so if you haven't had a chance, to lean in and get to know them better, this would be a great time to do it. Even at I love that giant piece of pizza on the pastor with the pizza slide. I'm like, I'd like that slice of pizza. That looks amazing. Tonight would be a great time to, even meet with them. And I also just want to take a moment and encourage you here at Hope City Church. What God is doing in this church is unique. God is up to something here. You are on the ground floor of a move of God in this community, and the fact that you're here is just amazing. So thank you for that, particularly for the folks who have leaned in and got more plugged into community, folks that are serving on the dream team or maybe plugged into a small group or, volunteering in some way or just coming on a regular basis even. What you're doing is fueling something that's making a difference here in Sarasota. That's bringing hope to people in this community. And so thank you for being a part of that. Today, as we wrap up this series, all on community, it's been amazing to kind of talk about what does it mean, how do we do life together, what does it look like. Well, today we're kind of changing our focus a little bit and saying, how do we relate to the community around us? So we've been talking about kind of the community in a church with our families and kind of this community, but today we're going to kind of turn the eyes to the world around us. Now, I'm a parent. I've got 2 kids. I'm not sure how it's possible, but I have a senior in high school and a sophomore. I'm not sure how that's possible, but and so my daughter is like heading off to college in the fall, and I'm like, that seems very crazy to me. I don't know how that happened, but I feel like I just was heading off to college, and here that's happening. And it's interesting as a parent, and I'm sure you can relate to this as a parent, that there's this interesting tension as we're raising our kids around how we relate to the community around us. Like we feel maybe it's just me. I'm maybe not as good a Christian as you, but I struggle with how do I help my kids be fully engaged in the community around us while not getting run over by the broader culture? By how do I help them be to live their faith out in the world around us? I don't want to just hide them away. I don't want to just kind of say like you should be in this holy huddle somewhere. But to be honest, I feel the tension of that, and I'm like, man, there's days where I think that might be easier, and I find that as a tension, and it's actually kind of interesting to watch that play out with my own kids because it really gives me a reflection on my own life. So just 2 recent examples, and if you're parents, you have this kind of thing happen to you all the time. My son's really big into music. He's in 5 bands, which is crazy. Like, I'm not sure how he can keep the 5 bands. I can't keep them all straight. He's really into music, loves music, and he's always wanting to play me the latest song on the radio. And so we're driving recently. He's like, oh, Dad, I love this song. It's great. And, we put it on the radio, and we're driving along, and it's a really good song. I'm like, this is really cool. I can't remember who it was by. And it was like really cool, really intricate, and really nice. And then all of a sudden, the performer drops an F-bomb in the middle of, and it wasn't the word forgiveness. It was a different word. And there was this moment, right, where it's like, I could see he was like, oh my goodness, I just told my dad this is a great song, and it's got this really bad word in it. And I had an opportunity to respond at that moment and say like, hey, how do we respond? I'm not going to tell you how I responded. Or my daughter, actually, this just happened 2 nights ago. She was over at a good friend of hers, probably her best friend's house. And, like it's still, even at this age, they're like sleepovers and all that is still happening, which I thought that, went away, but it doesn't really. And, they were having, so I picked my daughter up in the morning and it was great. And I said, well, what was the night? How'd you guys do? What'd you up to? And she said, oh, we watched The Incredibles. I don't know if you remember The Incredibles movie. And so that was like a movie when my kids were young. Like that came out when they probably saw it the first time around. Next Incredibles is coming out in 2019, which I'm excited about. Brad Birch directing again, which is great. Sorry to be a geek about that. But The Incredibles, and she said, yeah, we watched The Incredibles. And she said to me, Dad, it's amazing how you pick up on different things about movies when you get older. And I was like, yeah, tell me about that. And she said, well, there are some interesting humor in there that I didn't see when I was a kid. And I was like, yeah, that's true, right? They kind of do a good job of having them happen on multiple levels. Music, media, movies, the broader culture, our community. How are we supposed to relate to all these things? How is a Christ follower supposed to honor him in the midst of all this? But that's really just the life of you and I as a Christ follower in our culture today. How do we respond to the broader culture? Because our relationship with Jesus and the community around us is integral. How we figure out how our faith works with our broader community is integral. A couple of years ago, I got back from summer vacation. And I was thinking about this as I was in Forever Summerland down here. I was thinking, man, I got back from summer vacation. It was August. And I don't know if you've ever had this happen. I literally got back, I think it was the second week of August, when I looked in the mail, and this was at my mail already. It was the Halloween costumes, the second week of August. And I was like, what's the second week of August? Why are we talking about Halloween already? I just about snapped. It's August, and no one is thinking about it. You're not thinking about it in February, that's for sure. But, you can't escape it. It was like right there. It was in my face. And over the years, actually, as a parent, Halloween was an interesting kind of template for how we tried to help our kids relate with the world around us. We're constantly confronted with culture that doesn't point people towards Christ. That I feel like, and Halloween's kind of an interesting example of that, because it's like a broad example of that, or it's maybe a dramatic example of that. Is there any way to redeem something like this for the cause of Christ? Halloween is one of those parts of culture that I feel at odds about. It seems like the trend is for boys to dress up, in really scary costumes, and girls are to dress up in, not scary costumes, but sending a different message. I know. Just go with me here. I know it's the end of February. Why are we talking about Halloween? What does this have to do? But I do think it's an interesting conversation point that may feel at a safe distance away, because it's not until the fall, for us to think about the broader culture, for us to think about how do we relate to the community around us. Some of you are saying, what's the big deal? Kids dressing up in costumes like this. I think we've got a picture of that, the next one, which is like kind of scary. And walking around neighborhoods, getting candies. You may not see the tension in that at all. Well, there's some of you are thinking Halloween is a dangerous pagan tradition that we just need to shield our kids from. It's the kind of thing we just need to make sure that they don't have any, part of it. And as the stores in the fall, they start to stock up with this more earlier and earlier. Like, I don't know, you saw this at Christmas this year. It was like Christmas ended, and then Valentine's Day was there right away. It's like it seems to jump on us. But for those, for us as parents, how are we trying to figure out how do we relate to this? You can't just open up your Bible and look up Z for zombies. It's just not there in the Bible at the back in the concordance. But there is a time in the New Testament that I think gives us an idea of how we're supposed to relate to our broader culture, to our broader community. So if you've got your Bible today, I'm going to ask you to turn to Acts chapter 17. I'm not sure where that is in the Bible, so if you've got that, open it up, or I don't know what the page number is, sorry about that. But you're going to open up Acts chapter 17. Acts is in the New Testament on the right-hand side, and we see an incredible part of the story of the people of God that really does mess with my thoughts about how we are to interact with the broader community. How are we to relate to those people around us? To give you a sense of where we find ourselves in the story, just to kind of set this up. Paul, the guy who's the primary player in this story, he was an evangelist. His job was kind of like Billy Graham, which we didn't get a chance to talk about this morning. He went from town to town proclaiming the message of Christ. He was a messenger of the good news. He traveled all over the Roman world. In fact, ended up actually in Rome at the end of his life. He would go both into synagogues, so into their churches of the day, but then actually would rent places to meet. He would rent places, I was going to say movie theaters. Don't think he rented movie theaters. He rented local town halls and gathered people together and did incredible things. Well, we find himself at this point in the city of Athens, which is the modern day of Athens in Greece. When we see him concerned, he was distressed. And let's look at the passage here. This is what he says in Acts 17, verse 16. He was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols, full of idols. You know, I can't believe it. I love it. It's one of these. This is one of those things that I think the Bible, when it's written, it just misses the translation for us today. It's like it sounds way too safe. Actually, greatly distressed would probably be better translated. He was totally pissed off to see that the world, that the city was full of idols. Literally, the city was full of all these idols. We have a lot in common with Athens of the day. You know, I think our community is very similar, actually, to Athens. That was a pre-Christian culture at that day. You and I really do believe we live in a post-Christian culture. So, Athens was the kind of place where the message of Jesus hadn't impacted yet, and the communities we find ourselves in are the kind of community where Jesus was once lifted high, but just that's not the case anymore. Idols in their day were named Athens and Venus, but today it's maybe Drake and Taylor Swift and Brad Pitt. We have these things that we look up to and we lift them high in our day. So do you feel at odds with the community around us? Do you look around and say, wow, things are distressing to me? Music, media, movies, Halloween. How do you feel when you relate to those things? Now, I know. In our modern eyes, we think about like idols and we're like, listen, come on. Like that seems very strange to me. Like I don't know anyone that has like a little idol, that they bow down to or they put change in front of or that kind of thing. It's not a part of their day. But this was a dark and sinister part of Paul's culture. That what was happening in that day with idols was not something cute and cuddly. In fact, it was quite dangerous. It was the kind of thing that was actually destroying people's lives. See, Paul was a religious dude. He had his heart set on God, and when he saw idol worship, he knew that wasn't God's plan for the world. In fact, idols were in the top 10 list of the things that God really spoke against. And we see that in Leviticus 19, verse 4. We said, do not turn to idols or make metal gods for yourself. Metal gods, I guess Bon Jovi's out. No metal gods were allowed in that day. So this was, in the top 10, the 10 commandments where, God said, listen, idols are the kind of thing you should turn away from. So what is Paul supposed to do? Here he is. He goes into a new community. He wants to, win people for Jesus in this community. He wants to fit in with this community. He wants to reach people in this community. He feels like he's got a message that he wants to tell people in that community. But everywhere he looks, what does he see? He sees these idols. He sees influences in the culture that are pushing in the wrong direction. Well, one thing he could do is he could reject this. He could go bananas. He could get totally pissed off. He could have ran through that community and kicked over idols, and everywhere he went, made a huge show and got into a culture war. He could have started a letter writing campaign to the leaders of that community and said, we need to remove all these idols from our streets. He could have got on every talk radio show and said, this is the day we need to reject all of this. He could have done that. He could have, we've done what we seem to do today, which is boycott things. He could have been, I'm just going to boycott the entire town of Athens. I think sometimes we take the same approach in the culture around us. We could just reject everything that we see. We could go out of our way to kind of get angry with our culture and maybe work hard to, shut down any conversation. Maybe at your work. There's the last Friday of the month, everybody from your work goes out for drinks. and after work, it's kind of it's a bit of a tradition. What do you do in that moment? You know that some of the stuff that ends up happening after that is not positive. So you could, as a Christian, stand against that. And on that last Friday, when everyone's handing out, you could put your nose in the air and say, I don't want anything to do with that. I reject that. I reject this opportunity. Now, Paul also had another opportunity. He had another way he could have responded. Instead of rejecting that culture, he could have blindly simply received the idols. He could have been like, man, it's okay. Let's just go with the flow, man. Like, let's make a little Jesus idol. In fact, let's make him, a really nice Jesus idol, and let's put it in amongst all these, and we'll put it, what we're going to do? We're going to buy a prominent place on a prominent street, maybe right in front of the temple of Athena, and we're going to have this Jesus idol there. We're going to ask everyone to come and bow down. You see, and he could have just, instead of rejecting it, he could have just been like, it's okay, let's receive this. Let's just say this is normal. This is a normal part of the process. Receivers say that all truth, man, all everything that happens, it's just God's truth. It's fine. Like, let's just let it happen. If Paul took this approach, he probably would have won friends very quickly in the town of Athens. In fact, he would have just integrated quickly, and people would have said, like, oh, there's this new guy from far away, and he's got another new idol. In fact, it's a fancy-looking idol, and it's in a nice part of town. He could have, instead of confronting culture, he could have simply conceded to the community around him. Let's get back to the Halloween thing for a second. Have you ever felt that same tension? What do you do with that? How do you live out that moment? Again, go with me here for a moment. Should I simply reject that and say, there's just no way? Or maybe I just receive it. And I remember when my son, he wanted that costume. Actually, there's a picture of it earlier. He wanted that costume, which you've seen. It's I forget what it is, that one costume where it's like a mask and like the blood all runs down the front of it. And you're like, I want that one. And I'm like, that's not a great costume, son. But what do we do in that moment? Well, I think actually let's look at what Paul does, because he doesn't reject or simply receive. He actually points a third way. Let's look at Acts 17, 22 to 23. Listen to what he does here. He says, Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, people of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. So you are very ignorant of the very thing you worship, and so I'm going to proclaim to you. So it's an incredible passage. So what does he do? He walks in and he says, to catch what Paul did there, he found a third way. He didn't stand up and say, this idol thing is totally screwed up. And he didn't say, hey, this idol thing is amazing. Let's just worship Jesus. He found a third way. He didn't reject this community. He didn't reject the place he was in, the culture he was in. He didn't simply receive it, but he found a third way. He chose to redeem it. Can we say that together? Redeem. Redeem, very good. Well, what does that mean? It's one of those words that we only seem to hear in church anymore. It's not one of these words that we hear a lot about. It simply means to find value in something worthless. Years ago, and I don't even know if this happens anymore. It seems like recycling. Now we just give them away. But years ago, when I was a kid, I used to get a pop bottle, and you'd take it off, and soda, and you would take it back to the store, and they would give you 5 cents. And so you would scour the neighborhood to find these, and you would find these things, and they were of no value because people had thrown them out. And what you would do is you would take that and you would redeem it at the store, and they would give you a nickel and say, here's, a nickel for that. That's what redemption is. It's taking something that's worthless and gaining value out of it. He took a broken thing and turned it into something new. So how do we do that? Well, I see 3 things that Paul did in this passage, 3 quick things. He didn't hide. First of all, he observed. He didn't hide from the culture. What did you see? You get this picture of him walking around town and engaging on what's going on. He didn't live in denial. He wasn't pulled away and had no idea what was going on. He actually had his eyes wide open and was like, hey, what's happening in this community that we're in? We're not trying to hide from it. He's trying to have our eyes open and observe. Secondly, he complimented the town. Now, see, in the passage here, what does he say? He says, I see that in every way you are very religious. Now, to our ears today, if someone was to walk up to your work and say, hey, I think you're very religious, we probably don't receive that today as a compliment, right? That's one of those things that people are like, you'd be like, no, I'm not religious. It's about a relationship with Jesus. You kind of push back against that, which is fine. That's good. But actually, to Paul's listeners of the day, this group that he was meeting with, when he would have said to them, hey, you're very religious, they would have received that as a compliment. They would have been like, wow, that's amazing. In fact, what he was doing was praising their spiritual curiosity. He was saying, wow, God's doing something in your life. And then he built a bridge. Now, what Paul does here, I think if we actually lived this out, most churches you'd be like, wow, these people are heretical. Like, we don't do anything close to what Paul does here in Acts 17. What does he say? He says, I walked around town and I saw an idol with this inscription, to the unknown God. And then Paul later, what he does is he goes on, and we'll see this in a minute, he goes on and he actually says, I want to tell you about this unknown God. I want to tell you about what Jesus has done. And he uses that as a bridge. He uses the starting point of what was going on in culture, which he knew, actually from Leviticus, was actually negative. It was actually, God actually said, don't have anything to do with that. And he actually used that as a starting point to point people towards Christ. Do you see how radical that is? That is an amazing step to take as we interact with our community around us. Now, I think for you and I, living in a post-Christian culture, living in a place that doesn't point towards Christ naturally, you and I should be looking for ways that we can use the culture to build a bridge, ultimately to say, hey, wow, we see something in you that's amazing. And you know what? That points us towards Jesus. That points us towards what he wants to do in your life. It's hard to overstate how incredibly irreligious what Paul did was here. First century thinkers who would have read this, people who would have heard this for the first time, would have said, oh, no, he didn't. They would have been like, this is crazy. In fact, it was the kind of thing that probably, as the word spread of this is probably why this is in the Bible, is it would have been seen as incredibly scandalous. People would have been like, that's crazy. That's amazing that he did that. Because the idea of the day was to simply reject the culture or reject community or maybe receive it. There was this tension even at that time. But Paul, what he did was he chose another way. He chose to redeem it. Let's look on to the next, a little bit later down in the passage. So this is after he says, when they heard about the resurrection of the dead. So this idea of Jesus coming back from the life and ultimately that representing and talking about us coming back to life, some of them sneered. But others of them said, we want to hear you again on this subject. At that, Paul left the council, and some of them became followers of Paul and believed. Among them were the Dionysius and members of the Areopagus, and also a woman named Damaris, and a number of others. So interesting thing here. Paul declares the message of Jesus. He talks about the resurrection. He talks about the fact that when you follow Christ, that there's going to be a day where you have hope in the fact that you're going to rise from the dead and actually sit with God in heaven. And there's this amazing response, which again, I think should be an encouragement for us today. Because what happened? Some people believed. Some were like, wow, I want to become a follower of Christ. I want to become a follower of Paul. I want to follow what you're saying. I want to grow in my relationship. Some, they were curious. They were like, okay, that's interesting. I want to, in a very Greek sort of way, I'd like to hear you more on this subject. I want to talk to you more about that. That's a very first century Greek kind of way to think about it. And then some actually sneered. Some are like, you're crazy, man. That's a bad idea. Now, I think for us, for you and I, as we engage in our community around us, that pattern's how people are going to respond to us. Some people, as we reach out to others around us and talk about the message of Jesus, some people are going to respond to Christ and are going to come to know him and are going to want to grow closer to him. Some are going to be interested. They're going to be like, okay, that's interesting. I'm not sure I totally believe that, but I'm going to come back for more. I'll listen more. And then some are going to sneer. Some are going to be like, that's a crazy idea. What you're talking about is crazy and doesn't connect to my life. I find encouragement in that because if Paul, if he had that kind of response, what's it going to be like for people when I talk to them about Jesus? Well, so what can we learn from the way Paul dealt with his culture, with what Paul went on in his world, and how do we relate that to us in our day today? How can we relate the fact in what he did with his pre-Christian culture, and then how with our post-Christian culture? Again, back to the Halloween thing. It's one of those times of year, we always seem to have that guy on our street. That guy, you probably have him on your street too. That guy that gets just a little too much into Halloween. We had a guy on our street once. Every year, it seemed like he tried to amp it up and make it more and more scary. And actually one year, this was in Jersey, down the road from us, he had, it was what it was is all these mannequins, and they were it was like they were operating on a guy, but they had all these power tools. He had what looked like a saw and all this stuff on him. That is scary. And then on Halloween, he actually had them all running, and then he was there with and I'm like, dude, it's crazy. I don't want to be a part of that. And so I was struggled with, actually, I worked for a guy that did he was a pastor, and he was that guy on the street, which is a little bit strange. It's a whole other story. I'll tell you about that again. But as a family, what we tried to do over the years was we were this is an amazing opportunity. People are actually out in our neighborhood walking around. They're actually out, coming to our door. Gone are the days where we could walk door to door, but actually everyone's coming to our house. So what we decided to do for years, we did this. Let's put the next picture up. We got one of these big bounce houses, and we rented a giant bounce house and put it on our front lawn. And, the next picture here is a picture of Christine and me. That's my wife. She's amazing. It's not my daughter. I know it looks like my daughter. She's much younger. But we get into it. We get totally dressed up, and we'd say, hey, let's throw a party on our front lawn. I know what you're saying. A pastor throwing a Halloween party? Shut the front door. Why on earth would you do that? Well, I love the fact that my kids have grown up with the memory of we're going to make a big deal on this day. We're going to try to invite our community in. And rather than being that family that is, turning off the lights and hiding away from everyone and, huddling and being we're so pious, we're not going to, do that. What we said is, no, let's try to serve the people in our community. We would put out the bounce house and we'd make coffee for parents and do all these kinds of things to try to make it a great place for people to hang out in our community, say, hey, that's the kind of place I want to be. That's the kind of place I want to hang out with. Now, you see, what impact did this happen? Well, I remember there was this guy that I heard his name lots of time when my son was younger. His name was Fred. And you sometimes hear about the kid in your kid's class where it's all the time you hear about Fred's getting in trouble. Fred got kicked out of class today. Fred, blah, blah, blah. Fred, all the stuff that was going on in Fred's life. And Fred was the bully in, my son's class. He was the kid who, would kind of pick on my son and would, make fun of him and, that sort of thing. And we were trying to help my son through that. Well, I still remember the day we were standing on Halloween looking out, and my son comes up to me and he's like, Dad, that's Fred. He's about to get in the bounce house. And I was like, oh, wow, that's great. I'm glad he's here. And you can see my son, what are you talking about? I said, why don't you go jump in the bounce house with him? It'll be fine. And so I went over and I saw there's Fred's dad. And so I thought, no, this is an interesting opportunity. So I went and saddled up to Fred's dad and introduced myself. And, we had a little bit of small talk. I got him some coffee and, some water and got to know him a little bit. And, Fred and I became, I don't want to say we became super close friends. I don't want to this isn't one of those stories where at the end, we knelt down and he accepted Jesus. That's not where this conversation is going. But he and I started that day a small friendship. And actually, I got to know more about what was going on in Fred's dad and mom's life and their relationship. And actually, it gave me, a more understanding about why Fred was acting the way he was acting. Fast forward a couple years, and Fred's dad and I, we became a little bit closer. We moved from, guys that would just see each other on Halloween to the point where, on the schoolyard, we'd give the, hey, we were those guys, hey, good to see you. And then a couple years later, Fred and his dad, I keep seeing him around town. But then actually, eventually, my son ended up on Fred's Little League team, and Fred's dad was the coach. And I thought, this became an interesting relationship in our lives. And over the years, we got to know each other a little bit better. We invited them to church. They actually came once, which was kind of cool. We got to build a bit of a relationship with him. I was able to help my son manage through those relationships. And if it wasn't for this strange kind of pagan holiday of kids wearing weird costumes and coming to our house with a bounce house, that relationship wouldn't have started. It wouldn't have began that. So what? What difference does that make for you and I today? What difference is that? Because it's not Halloween. This isn't like, okay, so rent a bounce house, because that's months away. How does this fit in to your life? I trust that if you're a Christ follower here today, one of the questions you're asking in life is, how do we relate to the post-Christian community we find ourselves in? How do we relate to the people who we find ourselves connecting with on a regular basis? Well, did you know that only 17% of people in our country here, next slide, I think that's the next slide. Yeah, 17% of Americans attend church on a regular basis. And that number is decreasing. This is actually probably one of the most positive numbers. I've actually seen that as a lot lower number over the years. And, with Halloween, it was one of those times where I was like, are more than 17% of my neighbors going to be out walking around? And there absolutely are more than 17% of the people walking around in our community. And so I wanted to leverage that as an opportunity. But so as a church, as we're wrestling with, how can we find times in our community to share the message of Christ? How can we reach out and find ways to reach people with the message of Jesus? And I think you and I need to have our eyes open. The kind of big line question, we need to be finding times where things are happening in our culture. The question we need to be asking is not how we're going to reject them or just simply receive them and kind of like, okay, whatever, let's just receive that, but really finding ways to redeem them, to really leverage that opportunity. And we have one of those opportunities coming up very soon. It's one of those opportunities that you and I have every year. Did you know that 40% of Americans attend church on Easter weekend, which is crazy. So that's a lot of people. That's a lot of people here in Sarasota County that are going to decide, to come to church. That is one of those weekends where two things happen. For some reason, when you invite your friends, they're more likely to come. And I'm not sure why that happens on that day. But it is one of those weekends when you reach out and say, hey, would you want to come with me to Easter? People will say yes. But, this statistic is an interesting one. But actually, the one that's more interesting to me is the fact that 20% of Americans are undecided about attending Easter in the week before. So there's 20% more people on top of that 40 who are waffling one way or another. So there are friends in your community, friends at, in your, in your kid's class at school, or maybe somebody at work who are kind of going back and forth thinking, I'm not sure whether I want to go or not. That's incredible. What does that mean for us here? That means there's 81,109 people in Sarasota County who are wrestling about in the coming weeks, who are thinking, should I attend church or not? Should I go to Easter somewhere? Talk about an opportunity to get out and redeem the culture. Talk about an opportunity to connect with our community. Now, the interesting thing about Easter is I think a lot of Christians are at conflict about it, because on one side, it is literally, like Peter said, it is the hinge of history. It literally is that time for us as Christ followers where it's like the most important thing happened. Jesus died and then came back to life, and we celebrate that on Easter. But then there's this whole other part of Easter, which is like somehow like bunnies and like Easter eggs and like, I'm not even sure. For a long time as a kid, I was like, bunnies and eggs, like eggs come from chickens. Why does the Easter bunny bring eggs? Like, I still find that really confusing. And chocolate and all of that. How does that all fit together? And so I think for us as Christians, we can be like a little freaked out by that. And we're like, I'm not sure I want anything to do with Easter bunnies and eggs, because I want to just focus on the message of Jesus on that day. But actually, a lot of people in our culture, they really do think a lot about eggs and chocolate and all of that. And so our opportunity as a church is to, rather than say, let's reject that, let's just be like we're the anti-egg church because of the whole bunny chicken thing. Not sure what happened there. Or we could just be like, oh, it's fine, whatever. Like, don't worry about it, just whatever. Or maybe we say, maybe there's an opportunity here. Maybe there's an opportunity for the gospel. It's an opportunity to talk about the message of Jesus. And so I want to actually invite Pastor Peter up, because there's something exciting thing we want to announce today. Peter, what's going to be exciting? And that's just in 4 weeks. That's coming up.
Yeah,
that's
Easter is around the corner. April 1st, which is maybe the greatest April Fool's joke that has ever happened in the history of the world. is when Jesus
can't
was
make that
like,
joke on that
no,
day."
it's not happening. So we'll save that joke. Just
Yes.
forget it. It'll come back in 4 weeks. But here's the thing that we found last year. We did this thing on Easter where we hired a helicopter to come and drop 10,000 Easter eggs out of a helicopter on the backfield. Actually, only about 9,575 came out because half the bags opened up inside the helicopter. But it was still a great time. So we invited our entire community to come join us.
Who was at this last year?
Yeah, how many of you were there?
A few people were there. Okay, good.
Okay, and some of you, that actually may have been your first Sunday here at Hope City.
Totally.
And so we decided that we wanted to do that all over again. When you see pictures of some of the kids' spaces, there's one picture where Paige is teaching about 40 pre-K students in a hallway back over here, and she's got their whole attention. She's captured their attention. And it was on that Easter day when we invited our entire community. You know, you hear us talk a lot about how we are for Sarasota, that Hope City Church exists for Sarasota because we believe that God is for Sarasota. And one of the things that I want to share with you, it's been on my heart, it's been on my mind a lot, is that the gospel does not call us to segregation. The gospel does not call us to be this group of people that removes themselves from society. The gospel calls us to integration. The gospel calls us into action. It puts us in position to love our neighbors and to love them very well, which is why I love this message. That's why I asked Pastor Rich to talk about this. There's so much that you and I can be doing. And so I want to invite you to be a part of this. I want to invite you to be a part of the church that is saying, you know what, we are going to integrate with our community. We're not going to segregate ourselves out from that. And one more thought is this past week, Reverend Billy Graham, 99 years old, went home to be with the Lord. The entire world has stopped and taken notice of this. CNN, Time, everybody is talking about the Reverend Billy Graham. And here's one of the things that they're talking about, is they're talking about how he was a powerhouse for the Lord. These are people that are far from God who are saying that man loved the Lord and was a powerhouse for God. But here's what I thought, is that as our world stops and is like, you're incredible. Reverend Graham, you are incredible. You are a pastor to presidents. You are a pastor to the entire world, right? You're the people's pastor. He also stepped into heaven. And I was driving, Rich, and I was like, I don't know that heaven was like, hold up, everybody, Billy Graham's here. Like, hold on. Whoa.
Yeah. Right.
Like, I don't think that actually heaven stopped and took notice that Billy Graham entered into the space.
Yeah.
Because here's what we love. We love that Billy Graham stood on a stage in front of thousands and millions of people, and he led billions of people to know Jesus. But I actually think that Jesus, that God, is far more impressed with people who are doing small things faithfully rather than great things sporadically. And so we have an opportunity. We're on Easter. It's 4 weeks from now. We're going to be dropping 12,000 eggs out of a helicopter. Wow. And so we want you guys to be a part of that, to be faithful in serving our community, to be for Sarasota. So actually, if you guys take out your phones, because again, we're not anti-technology either. So get your phones out. And I want to invite you to text the number 97000, to text the word egg drop, all one word, to 97000. And we're going to text you immediately back. We've got people in the back who are,
Oh, yeah.
Frantically texting, right?
Under this. Yeah, that's behind those curtains.
And so, exactly. And so we're going to text you a link where you can sign up to be a part of this day. We have one service. We're going to be 9 o'clock to 10:30. It's a 90-minute Easter experience that you will not want to miss out on.
So there's really two things I think you're saying today, right? What we're asking you to think about, what we'd like you to do, and that's what the text is. And I did 2 words. I did egg drop because I'm a little slow. I did it as 2 words. So do it as 1 word, egg drop. And this is an opportunity for you to serve, because we're looking for people who will say, I'd like to volunteer, I'd like to help out. It really is a cool opportunity. You get front row seats to see something really great. Maybe Peter will let you go in the helicopter. I don't know. You'll get front row seats to see that. But then the other piece of this puzzle is inviting friends, right? Is going out of your way to do, to say, hey, maybe there's some people in your community that you would love to be a part of this. And, we're in the coming weeks, you're going to get a chance. We're going to be giving you opportunities with some flyers and stuff like that to hand those out. Now, we're not giving you these today, but once you be thinking about who you can be inviting. In fact, I'd like to challenge you to really think of 3 groups of people that you should be inviting. The first is, that person that has said in the past, like, oh, yeah, I'll come to church sometime. You probably have someone, because you're all good people. You've invited someone. Now's the time for you to invite them. Pastor Peter is working already on his message on that day. It's going to be a clear opportunity to talk about what it means to follow Jesus. It's one of those, it's a message of hope. I know we talk about that so much, but it really is going to be an opportunity to say, hey, I want to get them there on that day. And so there's that first group that you're like, yeah, they're like, yeah. If you invite them, you know they're going to come. But then there's that next group of people that are like, you're not too sure. It might be that you don't know them very well. They're maybe like maybe they're like on your cul-de-sac and there's that family across the road and you're pretty sure they have kids and like all kids like chocolate and they would love to see the helicopter and all that. So invite those people. That kind of, you're not too sure of that group. And then the third is the absolutely called like the Hail Mary. They're like, I'm pretty sure they're never going to come to church. Like they're just never going to come. In fact, they might be actually anti-Jesus. I'd love for you to push in and say, let's invite that person as well. Because we're praying as a church, we're praying that, that as you make those invites, that God does something amazing. Speaking of Billy Graham, I had an opportunity to see him speak twice live. And it was amazing to watch. I think a big part of that was, God, it was obviously God at work. And he would always say that. In fact, one of the things I've thought as I've seen all that is I think he would be very uncomfortable with how much the focus is on him. Yeah. He would be like, it's not about me, it's about God at work in people's lives. But I think the thing that was great, that you and I can kind of live out, is he had the guts to just put it out there and actually say, hey, now is the time for you to respond. And there are people in your lives, you may not get a chance to stand in front of a crowd of 50,000, but you do have that person that you're like, I'm not sure they'll ever respond. Now's the time to say, hey, we'd love for you to come. We'd love for you to be part of that.
Yeah. In fact, I want to invite our ushers. You guys have your own Easter baskets that we're going to hand out right now. We want everybody to leave with one simple plastic egg. Because this is what I believe that, go ahead, just start handing them out. Just get everybody one of these eggs. Put this in a place where you're going to see it for the next 40 days. Where you're going to look at this egg, and so if you get a pink one and you want a blue one, cash it in later. Catch me outside. But you're going to want to find that. And let that be a reminder to you. Because one of the things, as Pastor Rich was talking, I went to John 17, verse 15. This is what Jesus says. Jesus is praying for you in this moment. His prayer for you is this. My prayer is that, not that you take them out of the world, that you protect them from the evil one. Yeah. That Jesus is actually praying that you and I would get into the world and integrate the world, integrate the gospel of Jesus into the lives around us. And so this is one of those opportunities.
Can I pray for us? I'd love to pray
that'd be
for us
awesome.
as we kind of pivot in and have the band come and all that. Let's pray.